Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to my look at Legion as a whole. I can't believe it's gone on to part 3. I thought Wrath the Lich King would have had the most to cover, but apparently not. In this portion we're going to be looking back at raids and a few more expansion features, the grey areas and what I think were some of the more negative points. Let's get on with it, shall we? So, raids. We had 5. Yep, 5. Considering Warlords of Draenor had 3, this was definitely a step up. Okay, Halls of Valor was pretty short, but even if we didn't get it, we weren't short on content to do. Let's start from the start, and let me tell you, it wasn't a good start at all. Emerald Nightmare was arguably the easiest tier of raiding to ever be put into the game, well, at least at a Mythic level. So Blizzard misjudged the power level the players would be at by the time Mythic would unlock. Players had been slamming Mythic Plus hard for a few weeks and outgeared Mythic from day one. After years and years all the way from vanilla and the speculation back then about how the Emerald Dream, the expansion or patch or even raid, this is what we got in the end, and yeah, that's probably all we're going to be getting of it for quite some time, if ever. Xavius dropped 18 hours after the release of Mythic. Yep, never mind bosses not surviving the first reset, Xavius didn't even survive the first day, and by many players' scenarios, the penultimate boss was considered to be harder. This was also due to Shadow Priests having the shining moment in their history of World of Warcraft's raiding with Surrender to Madness. This ability was insane, literally. At the start of Legion, it pretty much did what it was designed to do far too well. It put you into Void form, which was new to Legion. This let you cast while moving, and increased all of your insanity generating abilities by 200%. Void form also increased your damage by a flat 30%, reduced your cooldowns massively, and was an infinitely stacking haste buff. But your insanity drained faster and faster as it went on. So what's the catch then? If your insanity ever hits 0, you die. But the thing was, early on in Legion, players had a number of ways to pause insanity loss, and as long as they had something to hit, they just never risked exiting Void form and dying. Check out the world first DPS of Priests on Xavius here, early in the fight and later. They're crushing everybody, and the longer the fight goes on, the further they get ahead. Moving on though, we had a wholly unexpected mini raid release, only a little over a month from Emerald Nightmare, the Trial of Valor, a 3-boss raid taking place in Helheim. Honestly, it was kind of a surprise when it came out. Helya was to prove a much bigger challenge than anything so far in the expansion, though not too much so. She went down after 3 days. What I think Helya was really was the start of a push into a certain philosophy of designing raids in a certain way. So this has always been kind of a thing, but say a boss has 4 main abilities. Each one individually might not be too challenging, but what Mythic Helya started to do is see what happens when we, for example, take mechanic 1 and 4 and cross them over, or put a strict timer on needing to deal with mechanic 3 before mechanic 2 happens again. There were many points in this fight where if one person does one thing wrong, it's over for everybody. In Legion, the idea of personal accountability in raids was pushed in all of the hardest fights, mechanics that required far more coordination and for each and every player to know what's up and what they should be doing, far so than ever before. We'll talk about this more in tiers to come. Our next major tier was the Nighthold. This is where stuff would start to get real in Legion. After successfully assaulting Suramar through the storyline, it was time to take on the font of power itself, claim the Eye of Aman'Thul, and put a stop to Gul'dan once and for all. This raid was so hyped up, and I think it delivered on it big time. To be fair though, most of the bosses went down fairly fast. I remember the trend of first mythic bosses being a real freebie. That was the case with Scorpion. The fight was fun though, you could pad so hard on the ads. Trilliax with its funny cake mechanic, Hybotanus with a 3-way split and tons of mechanics. The real challenge however came mainly from the raid's DPS check boss. And now I'm going to play a voice line that will no doubt give some Mythic Raiders PTSD.
The stars align. Fear their portents.
Star Augur Atreus. Remember that whole personal responsibility stuff on Helya? This boss took that idea and turned it up to 11. It was also one of the most visually incredible fights ever to be put in a game in my opinion. It had a mechanic which extremely quickly made you realise which players you were carrying, as if you didn't already know that by now. This was a mythic only mechanic called Grand Conjunction. It marked most of the players in the raid with a sign. You had 10 seconds to get to the player with the corresponding sign. Failing to get there in time or touching a player with the wrong sign was an instant wipe. This, on top of having to do insane levels of DPS to beat a very tight enrage timer, made this a considerable challenge. Following this was Grand Magistrix Elisonge, who lasted a few more days and dropped one of the most powerful trinkets to have ever existed, Convergence of Time. An LFR version of this was better than most mythic trinkets by the way. Yeah, that got nerfed eventually, but it did take them some time to nerf it, before finally Gul'dan, after chasing him throughout Warlords of Draenor, we finally confront him, and what a fight it was. One of the most memorable bits is the sheer mad smack he talks before the start of the fight. There's a slightly different version for the Horde and Alliance, I'm sure you can remember it actually. I can't think of another boss where, even as a non-RPer, you feel it hits you. Towards the end of the fight on Mythic, there is also the reincarnation of corrupted Illidan, partially inhabited by Sargeras, before he is also brought down. Gul'dan lived for 11 days and took 248 attempts to bring down. Which brings us to the Tomb of Sargeras. This is where even the top 0.1% of raiders started to feel the burn of Legion's relentless content schedule and sheer difficulty. Much like many previous tiers, most of the bosses weren't too bad. I thought Mistress Zazine with all the different fish trying to eat you was a fun encounter. I quite like Demonic Inquisition and Desolate Host too, but I was playing a Destro lock and all the clue potential there was just glorious. Maiden of Vigilance also comes to mind too as another pure personal responsibility fight. It was kind of like Thaddeus, everybody gets a mark, cross those marks, you're gonna wipe kind of thing, though it was nowhere near as hard as Star Augur. The DPS requirement was comparatively much lower. What was memorable was the Tomb of Sargeras. The sheer number of bosses that had a soak mechanic was crazy. Off the top of my head, Mistress had one, Desolate Host had one, Maiden of Vigilance had one, though I remember Tanks trying to solo it early on. Fallen Avatar had one, and Kill Jaden had many. All of these were mechanics where you needed multiple people to stand together or close to each other to absorb some kind of big hit. There's probably more than that, but you get the idea. The first big wall of Tomb of Sargeras was the penultimate boss, Fallen Avatar. This was a big DPS check boss. It had extremely unforgiving mechanics as well. The boss would transition to phase 2 after hitting max energy or reaching a certain HP threshold, which you had to manage while soaking beams that give energy to the boss, runes that need at least 3 people in, and well, without going into detail, it was extremely easy to lose somebody, and you could not afford to lose anybody, because in phase 2 was a hard DPS check with a very short hard enrage timer. Even in the world first kill, players all use avalanche potions to avoid fall damage, so their healers could keep up and do a bit of extra damage. It was really that intense. And as you progress the fight, the boss would break platforms away as you went, and just a few seconds in the Green Mountain Dew here meant certain death. Just look how close to the edge this was at the end. Notice how every group has like 4 or 5 rogues as well. 2 were soak Garrus, remember, and rogues with Feint and Cloak were very good at soaking. But even after 453 wipes and finally seeing success, the joy of Fallen Avatar falling was short-lived, because the next boss was arguably the most difficult raid boss to have ever been put in the game, Kill Jaden Mythic. This boss was everything Legion had come to represent in one extremely difficult encounter. Personal responsibility, soaks, coordination, perfect performance, execution, and a constant roundabout of overlapping mechanics combined with literally dozens of points for one mistake by any one person equals wipe. Even on Heroic, this boss was considered harder than quite a few of the Mythic bosses. No boss had stood for as long as Kill Jaden did, or did pre-nerf. You see, like many of the hardest bosses ever, the difficulty level was set too high, and he had to be nerfed many times before anybody saw a kill on him. In fact, the first kill happened after 19 days and 654 wipes on this monster of an encounter, but Method themselves believed if fixes came sooner, it would have been possible by the end of the second reset. Historically, if a boss makes it past day 8, aka the start of the first reset where these players get a new ID and much more gear, then it's truly something else. For a boss to make it past the second reset is far rarer. Aside from being overtuned, it was mechanically very challenging. Let me talk you through some of the finer points of the fight. Armageddon, all of these must be soaked. If you miss one, wipe. Bursting Dreadflame, if 2 of these cross over, somebody dies, which is basically a wipe early on. Focus Dreadflame, you need most of the raid in this to soak it, also knocks you back. Rupturing Singularity knocks you far back. You can be knocked off the platform by this. Oh, and it happens during the Darkness phase as well. So you have to find Illidan for the true sight, stop ads casting, gather them whilst positioning so you aren't knocked off on a pretty low timer before the phase becomes unhealable. In fact, this knockoff was so severe on the world first kill, many players had to reroll to Goblin for their Rocket Boots racial. Classes like Priest and Shaman had no way to mitigate this knockback. This fight is intense. Even pre-nerf, it's one of the most mechanically demanding encounters Blizzard have ever put in the game. The average kill was 12 to 13 minutes long. But let's continue on, shall we? Antorus, the Burning Throne, where we took on a Titan and the World Soul of Argus. It was also pretty hype, like pretty much every tier before so far. Most of the raid went down pretty fast. Antorus had some interesting fights as well. They tried some kind of MOBA type fight with ENR, which was good in theory. At least they're trying new things, I guess. I don't think it went down too well overall. Imonar was very memorable with the whole bridge crossing gimmick, which you had to do 4 times on Mythic if I'm remembering right. We had King Garoth with the rolly balls going around the platform, and the first challenge for many came at the Coven of Shivara. But for the world first race, they tore through most of the raid. Being on Argus progress by the end of day 2, he wasn't such a pushover though, needing 320 wipes and 8 days before Mythic claimed a victory in the final tier of this grueling expansion of raiding. Perhaps the most memorable moment of the Argus fight for me was his anime looking one-shot once we get him to low health. That was so cool to see for the first time, and it all ends up with us imprisoning Sargeras with Illidan, his eternal jailer. What a series of tears, how Blizzard managed to bring it all back from the bleak start of Emerald Nightmare and then Tomb of Sargeras. I liked it a lot personally. It's come to the point now where I have to ask, what was bad about Legion? I've got a long old list for this as well, I'm sure you'll be glad to hear. Let's begin with the grey areas. Some you might love, others you might have hated. The damage and healing numbers by the end of Legion were completely insane. It started off with doing a few 100,000 damage, by the end it was millions. Literally millions. I mean, just look at some of the best performances ever on Antorus. I know these almost always involve some kind of cheesing mechanics to pad, but still, ENR 11.5 million DPS, and Tauren High Command 12.2 million DPS. I mean, what am I even looking at here? This is insanity. How about healing then? Hasabel 2.9 million HPS, Varamathras 3.5 million HPS. Imagine how your screen looks when you're putting out 3.5 million HPS in healing. You start to wonder if this is still WoW or Diablo at this point. Now don't get me wrong, you probably remember the first time your class hit over 1 million. Pretty sure it was a big end bolt for me. Seeing those massive numbers is fun. Gets to a point where it sort of starts getting a bit meaningless because everything's just so over the top. And once again, just look at Diablo. It has to abbreviate numbers, otherwise it'd just be a mess of digits flying about your screen all the time. If WoW carried on like this, it was going to be heading in this direction. And for WoW, I think it's better to have a little more understanding of what kind of numbers you're putting out. Because if a number is shown as 1 million or 1.1 million, that's 100,000 damage just condensed somewhere in there with no real meaning. Whereas if you show something as 1,000 or 1,100, I think that's a lot easier to understand, both from an outgoing and incoming damage perspective. I think Legion pushed the numbers in WoW about as high as they can go really. Secondly, and I think this one might just be me, but I don't really like allied races. Now, I'll fully admit this is not how I should be doing these videos. I should do them as how they were received at the time, which was very positive. However, I don't see another chance for me to say this in the future. It honestly feels like Blizzard are putting in allied races instead of new races or even new classes. They are eating into dev time that could be spent elsewhere, and there are just so many of them. Blizzard have gone crazy with how many of them there are, so clearly they're popular. I just feel as though, well, they don't add much to the game and just occupying space that different, potentially more interesting projects could be there instead. They are an easy option, the option Blizzard knows that works, which is why they've been pushed so heavily since they've been introduced. And I am saying this as somebody who's leveled a Void Elf and a Lightforged Draenei from 1 to 120. Yes, 1 to 120, not 110. Moving on though, the player in the story. It's always hero this, champion that. You're quite literally the protagonist on an intergalactic crusade to put an end to an army of endless demons using an ancient mythical weapon exhumed from antiquity for this sole purpose. The story of Legion is so larger than life and crazy. Just think, 2 expansions ago you were helping some pandas with big rabbits, now you're striking down demon commanders on their alien planet. The world revolves around you, the ground trembles at your feet, you're the champion, bringer of pain, legend, ender of nightmares, and, you know, so on. I thought the story of Legion was super cool, but if you thought it was over the top, yeah, I kind of agree. Next up, legendaries. Legendaries, or should I call them legendaries? One of the best and worst parts of Legion. Where do I start? Acquisition, maybe. The way you got them was terrible. It was pure RNG, throwing a net into a pool of up to a dozen legendaries, some of which were utter garbage. If you pulled out the frost braces as a mage, you were over the moon. The boots, you're kinda not so happy. There were over a dozen per class at launch, and your performance really mattered whether or not you had the right legendary, because there was objectively a right and a wrong one. Early on, legendaries caused so much drama, and yes, in time there was a vendor. Much later on in the expansion, you could do everything in your power to get a legendary and not get it for months and months. But once you got the best in slot ones, they were good. They were incredibly good. Some of the most fun I've ever had in World of Warcraft was doing Mythic Plus on my Fire Mage. swapping between legendaries to min-max my combustion cooldown, and the sheer utterly insane burst that a fire mage had then was completely unmatched. On pretty much every class as well, legendaries added a good amount to how you played. They were like additional talents and fleshed out your gameplay that little bit more. That's why I love them so much. In fact, given the choice of no legendaries or legendaries with all the RNG and imbalance, I would take them back, the Legion versions, easily, not even a decision. Despite all the RNG of getting them, despite their imbalance, they made your class better and more fun overall once you got them. This is going to be controversial. I think Legion has had the best iteration of legendaries in World of Warcraft ever, because they added something else for everybody's class. Complaining because of bad luck is just seeing it from one person's point of view. You know, if you had that legendary, you too would have enjoyed it. I accept the way they were acquired was absolutely trash, but the idea behind them and what they did was overall very good, in my opinion. Now for the negatives, in my humble opinion, of course. Master Loot was taken away. To this day, I don't even pretend to understand this. Okay, I do. But it affected such an incredibly small number of players compared to irritating some of your most loyal customers. Blizzard, I'm not seeing the logic here. So now you can only trade loot if it is equal or lower to what you currently have in your bag or equip, excluding bonus rolls. This meant if you were loot spec'd into something else by mistake and get that convergence of fate, well, tough. Get a Titanforged on a trinket you already had and wanted to trade it to a buddy because it's only a smaller upgrade for you? Nope. Want to focus on gearing certain classes that scale better or were needed for tank fights? Nah, just get lucky. What else did this stop? Mythic raids from running a loot council, assigning loot based upon player worth, and actually caring about gearing beyond RNG. Also, I have a bit of a feeling behind it that Blizzard sort of didn't really want to have players making mistakes when it came to trading loot out, and well, if there's no master loot, then you don't really need as many GMs, do you? Next up, borrowed power. Another one that was an issue looking back. Building up all of this power over the course of the expansion just to throw it away at the end and be left blank. This has clearly taken its toll in BFA. At the end of Legion, we lost so much. So much. We had artifact passives, actives, golden traits, legendaries, trinkets, and all the other stuff. At the end, we just lost it all overnight. Sure, Blizzard attempted to assimilate some of the best Legion innovations into talents, but there was just never quite enough space to make room for everything that almost felt like it was required. I'll never forgive Blizzard for making me choose between Phoenix Flames and Flame On. Anyways, our classes were a shell on which much had been built during Legion, and so much of it was removed in BFA. And in BFA, Blizzard would try and create a new temporary power system to disastrous effects, but we'll talk about that more when we get there. I think suffice to say our classes should be able to stand on their own 2 feet without artifacts or legendaries or any additional temporary buffs. Time gating. Legion was a big old culprit in making sure that we enjoyed the content at a pace Blizzard deemed correct. Suramar, Mythics, Broken Shore, Class Order Hall quests, dailies on Argus. It was just everywhere. And okay, there was certain other stuff to be doing in the meantime, but it did feel like sometimes, okay, you're done for the day, good job, we'll see you tomorrow, go away now. Fortunately, I think Legion had other good content to prop up this kind of attitude with. Strip it away and, well, that's how you get BFA. It was just annoying at times. Legion was the least alt-friendly expansion ever, even more so than TBC. In TBC, alt and friendliness was really just for raids and PvP. In Legion, it was for everything. So on a new character in Legion, you need to do the following. Okay, get your notepad ready. You need to hit level cap, complete your Order Hall questline, unlock your 3 or 4 artifacts if you're a druid, farm Order Hall resources to send followers out for missions, for artifact knowledge and for reroll tokens, start the Suramar questline and advance it a good bit if you ever want to do Court of Stars or Archway, farm Ancient Mana for Withered training, go for the gearing up train through World Quest, dungeons and so on. Oh, and don't forget Blizzard buffed the open world content considerably in 8.2. You need to farm artifacts or relics, do Mythic Plus keys, sort out your profession quests, and at that point you have a decent basis for a character. Unless you get a bad legendary, of course. Unlucky. In fact, World First players leveled multiple of the same character to level cap in hopes of getting the right legendary, as the first one you got had a much greater chance to drop. It was crazy. Also, Legion was arguably, and I would argue this, the most hardcore expansion for endgame raiding that World of Warcraft has ever seen or will ever see. The rank 14 grind in Classic is a joke compared to the hours you had to put in to compete at the top end in Legion. Rank 14 ends after a few months, Legion ends after a few years. It was relentless. One artifact power grind after the next. The Mega Guild Serenity was killed by Legion amongst various issues. When people talk about how hard Legion was, not just boss wise, but motivation wise, and I think some positives came out of this. So these guys were absolutely going all out for World First, but at some point the time investment was just not realistic for no financial gain. Many of these guys had full-time jobs or other commitments, and could sink 1 week or so into pure WoW degeneracy, but after that it became truly taxing, to the point where people started questioning whether they can really carry on living like this. I think it's this that finally made the world first race a heavily publicised event since BFA, which leaves me with my final point of the video. Thought I'd never get here. Titanforging. Didn't think I'd forgot, did you? Oh no. In Legion, gear could Titanforge. This meant it had a random chance to become incredibly stronger than it should have been. How much better? Well, let me put it like this. Emerald, Nightmare normal gear was like level 850. Heroic was 865, Mythic 880. Titanforging could go up to 895. Yep, that's right, just be lucky and you can have better gear than somebody clearing a raid on Mythic. This was extended to other raids too, so being lucky could always get you an item that was insanely powerful. Blizzard did this so that sometimes, especially on a reclear, you had something to look forwards to and something to remember. I still remember my mage's first kill on Heroic Fallen Avatar, getting a maxed Titanforge set of tier shoulders. It was disgustingly lucky. It felt good after all, but at the same time it's kind of silly that such sheer power gain can be assigned to luck. I guess that you could say the same about legendaries in Legion. Either way, I think it's important that players taking part in the content that's the most challenging are the ones that are the most rewarded from doing so. In BFA, Blizzard attempted to address Titanforging by limiting it and by introducing a new system, which let's just say has 1 or 2 problems of its own, which I'll talk about next time. I have no idea how this has gone on for so long. I hope you are finding all of this as interesting or nostalgic as I do. Looking back for me personally, this has been one of my favourite expansions ever in World of Warcraft. I really do miss Legion. You know, this has been my longest review to date, with the most positives and the most negatives, but overall it was just a great time to be into WoW. There are 2 types of people I think when it comes to this expansion: those who loved it and those who didn't play it. I'm glad to say I was in the former. The next installment will be Battle for Azeroth. We're getting very close to our current expansion, which I think is going to have quite a different tone from this one. If you've made it this far in the video, give yourself a pat on the back, and why don't you join me next time as we take a look at how Battle for Azeroth changed World of Warcraft. If you like what you see, give the video a like and subscribe, as there'll be plenty more to come. Take care guys, and I'll see you all in the next one.